like to open with a prayer.
We're delighted y'all came today because I see folks who darken the doors here lots of times, and others whose faces I don't recognize at all. But there's something about a common theme, a common love that can bring us together, and so I'm just grateful. I've chosen as our morning prayer a prayer from actually the woman who's identified in the first chapter of Dr. Allured's book, Mary McLeod Bethune. One of her homes she lived in during the height of her social activism in Washington, D.C. is actually a national parks monument and museum. She was, anyway, you might hear more about her, so I'm not going to say much, except that she's also a woman of faith. And she wrote this prayer. I'm only going to change a couple of outdated words, so let us pray. Father, we call thee Father because we love thee. We are glad to be called thy children and to dedicate our lives to the service that extends through the willing hearts and hands to the betterment of all humankind. We send a cry of thanksgiving for people of all races, creeds, classes, and colors the world over, and pray that through the instrumentality of our lives, the spirit of peace, joy, fellowship, and the human family shall circle the world. We know that this world is filled with discordant notes, but help us, Father, so to unite our efforts that we may all join in one harmonious symphony for peace and mutual love for all humankind. The tasks performed today with forgiveness for all our errors, we dedicate, dear Lord, to thee. Grant us strength and courage and faith and humility sufficient for the tasks assigned to us. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Dr. Allured grew up in Lake Charles from the age of 6. She graduated from McNeese State University in 1982 and completed her PhD at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville in 1988. Dr. Allured is a retired professor of history and women's studies from McNeese State University and is now an adjunct faculty member at the University of Arkansas. She has numerous publications on Southern women, including Louisiana Women, Their Lives and Times, published in 2009, Remapping Second Wave Feminism, The Long Women's Rights Movement in Louisiana, 1950 to 1997, published in 2016. The most recent book-length publication is the subject of the talk today, a collection of biographies entitled Southern Methodist Women and Social Justice, Interracial Activism in the Long 20th Century, which was published this year and is co-edited with M. Catherine Armistead. With Elizabeth Payne, she co-authored the upcoming book, Showers of Blessing, the story of Myrtle Lawrence, sharecropper and social activist, and the photography of Louise Boyle. She is currently at work on a book about the domestic missionary work of Southern Methodist laywomen. And before I invite her up, we and Reverend Angela Bullhoff did provide this book for the UWF ladies. It's in our UWF library, so it's available for us to check out. So I wanted to remind you of that. And I'm very proud and excited to have my sister-in-law, Janet, Dr. Allured, here to speak.
Thank you so much, Becky. Making a lot of noise there. Sorry, let me put my notes up here. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I really appreciate the invitation and so many of y'all turning out today. I love to speak to groups like you. I love to speak to UWF groups. So if you know of other people who are looking for a speaker, you can give them my name too. This research is really a labor of love. So I'm happy to speak with anyone who has knowledge, intimate personal knowledge about the UWF, or perhaps your parents or grandparents or someone like that. As I was telling, I forgot who was talking to me earlier, it's been so wonderful because everybody is so nice. Everybody is so good to work with. That's Methodist for you. If you ask me, they're just wonderful. All the archivists, all the editors, everybody that I've worked with. And I've been doing this project for about 10 years now, which is common for academic books. And I still have a lot more to go, too. So first, I just kind of want to talk a little bit about how I got interested in it, because people always ask me that, and kind of the limitations of the book itself compared to what I plan to do eventually. So the first thing for me to let you know is that my field in history is New South, which means post-Civil War South. So I'm a Southern historian of the South, and I'm a historian of women, which is why I had the book that she mentioned. Let's see. Yes, thank you, Isaac. That she mentioned came out in 2016, was about the feminist movement in Louisiana, because it marries those two fields. And so when people ask me how I got interested in Methodist or discovered the topic, because very few people are doing this topic, let me say that. It was while I was doing the research on this book that I noticed that so many of the women who were involved in second wave feminism, if they had a faith tradition that they identified, it tended to be Methodist. And so I was like, wow, I think there's something here. And an untold story. It was one that I didn't know either, even though I grew up Methodist. But that's not the reason that I came to this subject. It's because these people were very different. The ones I was reading about, the ones who were working on second wave feminism is kind of the one of my generation, like 1960s, 1970s era. And they were basically in support of pretty much the entire feminist agenda of that period, like in support of the Equal Rights Amendment, reproductive health control, reproductive control. Sorry, I'm stumbling a little bit. I'm actually a little bit nervous to talk in front of UWF, but I'll settle down. It's fine. But basically all of the issues that second wave feminists identified as progressive changes, the UMW people and their predecessors were supportive of those. And they were often the leaders of their group, units around the state of Louisiana, here and there, in this town or that town or the other town. Come to find out, the leadership was often Methodist. And so I thought, well, I need to investigate that a little bit further. So the second chapter of that book, I do talk about that. The second chapter is about faith, religion, and feminism. And so what I'm showing in that chapter is that faith and feminism are not antagonistic to each other, that in fact, especially in the South, a lot of women who were rabid feminists also had a faith tradition and went to church regularly. So the kind of dominant narrative of this movement, second wave feminism, is that faith was anathema to feminism. And the reason that they say that is because a lot of second wave feminists didn't like the churches because they, were built on a patriarchal model, right? And so in the North and in the Midwest and in the West, like the California feminists, they tended to be very secular and reject faith or reject feminism. Reject faith or reject their religious background, okay? So their way of dealing with the fact that the church, like everything else, was patriarchal in its structure was to leave it. But guess what? You can't reform it that way. If you're going to make the changes that you want to see, that is women having more power within the institution, within the structure, you got to stay in it. And so that's what they did. They chose not to leave because they thought the Methodist Church was reformable. And turns out it was. It was absolutely. So again, that led to so many of these feminists being Methodist, also because so many of them were active in UWF and its predecessors, which, by the way, is how I identify y'all, because as you probably all know, it went through a bunch of different name changes, and the easiest thing is just to say UWF and its predecessors. Anyway, because they were active, as you guys are, in UWF and its predecessors, they had gained very valuable experience that led them to be chairs of their local units of the ERA Plus or, NOW or whatever it was, because they gained experience in fundraising, in organizing, as you guys all know, right, in public speaking, all of those things. And also, and I'll say a little bit more about this as I move through, their focus, as yours is, was female. I mean, they focused on women, right? And also, traditionally, they were very free. They were autonomous, essentially. They were relatively free to decide how to do their fundraising, how to spend the money, that is allocations, and what positions they were going to take in terms of public policy, because they were entirely woman-led. From the beginnings, in the 1870s and 1880s, it's a single-sex organization. So they're not being controlled or dominated or told what to think at any point along the way by men, okay? And that's why they become feminist, right? Because of that, because they are free to be able to make these decisions and think for themselves without men leaning over their shoulders and telling them that. There's a couple of exceptions to that I can talk about if you guys want me to during the questions, but by and large, that is a true statement. In 1964, there was a reorganization which the women absolutely were opposed to, where the general board, the male-dominated board, hijacked them. It was kind of an ambush, and took over. They subsumed the women's organization underneath the general board, which meant that women got seats on the general board. They became 1/3 of the general board, but that means 2/3 are male. So, you know, do the math. So they're going to lose, right? If there's a vote that's really important to them that's different from what the 2/3 want, they're going to lose. And so they were very, very unhappy about that. Again, I can say more about that. That did change eventually in 2019, I believe it was, when the general board, the leader of the general board, issued an apology for having done that on behalf of the board, issued an apology and gave them back their autonomy in 2019. But the point I wanted to make there too is that was a diminution in their autonomy when that happened in 1964 against their vigorous opposition. But they did not lose their property, which is significant. They did not lose their property, and they did not lose the ability to fundraise. They kept their money, and that meant that they were able to continue to manage their investments, continue to decide how to allocate money, where is it going to go. The men do not have any control over that. I will tell you that that is the only Protestant denomination in the United States for which that is true. So why Methodist? That's why. Single-sex organization, not controlled by men at any point. Again, I can come back and talk a little bit more about that later if you want me to. So about the book, go ahead and move to the next slide here. Sorry, I have to kind of check and see what's coming up. So I like to do this. Maybe during the question and answer period I'll do this because I don't want to stop myself right now. But be thinking about that yourself. I'm sure you can come up with some names. Maybe some of them are in the book. But I'll ask afterwards, maybe make it a little bit more interactive for you guys to name those. Okay, go ahead and go to the next one. So here's, as Angela was saying, here's the titles of the chapters. So this book is co-edited with M. Catherine Armistead, as she said, who's the editor of Methodist Review. So she's also ordained Methodist, and I brought her on because I needed an editor, because her skills are better than mine in terms of editing, but also because I'm not Methodist, and so I'm Episcopalian. I've been Episcopalian my whole adult life. So I didn't want to, say or do something ridiculously stupid about Methodism, so she would know that, obviously. So I brought her in as the co-editor, but all of the research and the history itself was me. I did that, okay? Now, I work on, as Becky mentioned, lay women, like you guys, well, except for Angela, and maybe some of the rest of you who are ordained, but my love is lay women, UWF and its predecessors. And the reason for that is because I like grassroots history, for one thing. I like to know what ordinary people were doing, rather than just kind of the hierarchy, because the hierarchy always gets stuff written about them. We know about those people who are in positions of power. For one thing, they left a lot more records, right? And so their histories tend to get told. So I don't do clergy. That's not my field of expertise. I work on the grassroots, the lay women. So I had to bring other people in to work on the clergy. And so all of the people who wrote the chapters, as you see there under part 2, the people who wrote those are also ordained clergy, okay? On the other side, I wrote the 3, and I'll talk about them in a minute. the three that starts with Thelma Stevens. I'll probably just talk about Thelma Stevens in just a little bit, okay? Do you recognize those names? Well, I know you recognize Bethune, obviously. She's very famous. And Angela, that you could not have picked a more perfect prayer. I want to get that from you, okay? Send me the link. That was wonderful for you to do that. She just so encapsulated what these women were doing. Absolutely perfect. So anyway, aside from Bethune, do you recognize other names up there? Not the actress. I'm sorry. I should have seen that coming. I should have headed that off at the pass. But, of course, you'll see a picture of her. She's not the actress. I'm sure she gets that all the time. And I'll talk about her in just a second, too. Anybody else? Okay, good. I figured you would know Leontine Kelly, too. Go ahead and go to the next slide. There's Mary McLeod Bethune. One reason she was kind of in the news a lot recently was because Florida, along with many other states, changed out the statues that are in the Capitol building. You know, where every state gets 2 statues to put in Washington, D.C. in the Capitol. And southern states, this was a few years back, southern states had started removing the Confederate statues out of the statuary hall and replacing them with people who were more representative of their state. And so Mary McLeod Bethune was one of those 2 statues the state of Florida put into Statuary Hall in the Capitol building. So that was kind of a lot of news recently. But she's just generally very famous. Mary McLeod Bethune is very famous. There's been a lot written about her. But most of these other women, aside from Kelly, you probably didn't recognize their names. And Kelly is famous. Why? Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Sorry, I have to keep turning around and looking. Kelly is famous. Does anybody know? Angela, you might know. Mickey?
I believe she was the first woman, black,
Mm-hmm.
to be elected bishop.
Yep. She was right. She was the first African American female to be elected bishop, not only anywhere in the jurisdictions of the Methodist Church, but actually any denomination. She was the first African American woman to be elected bishop in any denomination, and it's not an accident that it's Methodists, because the women's division has had so much power, or influence, maybe I should say, in the Methodist Church. Okay, so those 2. I'll just read you, let me see who's coming up next. Oh, Charlene Kammerer. Does anybody know her name by chance? She's still alive, as you can see. She's one of my Facebook friends. Of Winter Garden, Florida. She was the first woman ordained in the Florida Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church in 1974, the first female district superintendent in that conference, and the first woman bishop in the southeastern jurisdiction of the United Methodist Church. Throughout her ministry, she modeled democratic and inclusive forms of leadership and governance, which is very common for these women who are going in as firsts. First bishop, first DS, first whatever it is. They're kind of the vanguard, and so they try very hard to make the accession to those positions more available to women. They try to open it up in such a way that women are in a position to be able to go ahead into those positions, accelerate, I started to say. So changes in leadership, procedural changes, you will find that the women make a lot of those kinds of things because they're moving into an institution that is male-dominated, and of course the structures that are in place are going to be beneficial to the men. And so they change those sort of structures as a way of getting other women to come in behind them. For all of these women, it's not about them. They don't seek the limelight, they don't seek glory. It's about a higher power, for one thing, and it's about assisting other people who are like themselves, people who are marginalized, who don't have advocates helping them pull through, and to open that up to diversity, which means, of course, minorities as well as women. So that's what she does. That's what most of these women do. LGBTQ plus Christians, she does that as well, makes that friendlier, makes the United Methodist Church friendlier to them and ministers of color. I like the picture of her on the left. Can you find her in that crowd? Wait, yeah, on your left, yeah. So way in the back, all men, right? And her. That's not easy, y'all. Let me just tell you that. That is not easy, to be the only female in a room full of men like that, many of whom are really not very nice to you, right? They don't like that you're there. They don't like that women are getting into these positions. They will try to make your life miserable. Not all of them. There's always exceptions to everything I say, right? Because that's the way humans are. But it's not easy to be the first to do anything, right? Next slide. I wanted you to see that Carol Burnett is not the actress. So all of these women are pretty amazing. Again, I didn't write these because I'm not clergy, and so I had other people write these, and then I edited and pulled them all together to summarize the themes that I was talking about in the book, which is in the introduction, so I wrote that, and then I wrote the epilogue or conclusion as well as those 3 chapters. So Carol Burnett is the executive director of 2 nonprofits, Moore Community House and the Mississippi Low Income Child Care Initiative. So she's in Mississippi. She advocates for low-income women and children, primarily single mother families, through a variety of strategic programs and initiatives. She and her compadres devise and enact strategies of resistance to take on patriarchal white supremacy in Mississippi. She devises the strategies. I cannot say that she's all that successful, but at least that's her fight. That's her raison d'etre, she thinks, to be able to, again, open things up to make things better for those who are marginalized and on the bottom. Again, if you have questions about the others, I can talk about those during the Q&A period. I'll be sure to leave some time for that. Before I go on, let me talk a little bit about the historiography of Southern religion. Historiography is a term that refers to the science of history, the way history is written, okay? And traditionally, of course, it was always male. And so when they were writing church histories, denominational histories, they tended to do the same thing. Well, traditionally, they were always male-dominated, right? So that's who you wrote about. But even as, more women began to move into the field, historians of denominations, like the Methodist Church, tend to skew very heavily male. Again, that's where the records are, and those are people that have power, right? And so those institutional histories of churches, which a lot of churches have those too, almost never talk about the women at all. It's like they weren't even there. And as y'all can attest, I'm sure Angela can attest, well over 50% of the work that goes on in churches is not done by the men, right? It's done by people like yourselves. Yes, absolutely. They're kind of the ground soldiers of these churches. So women's history seldom gets a mention. It's not as true as it used to be, but it's still largely true for many of these denominational histories. And again, the reason for that is because the women's division, as it was eventually known, the women's division was really quite separate. We would say like a separate 501c3. So it's a separate institution that's not, traditionally was not controlled by the men. So when people were writing denominational histories, they just didn't even go look at what the women were doing, because they could do that, write an institutional history without consulting that, because they thought of the women as separate, which they were, right? It's kind of amazing. I've been in a bunch of Methodist archives, as I said, over the years, and of course go in and ask for the women's division's records for that particular conference or jurisdiction, read through a bunch of those records, and they're always so surprised when I come in and ask for that. Because they're like, no one ever asked for those records. I'm literally the first person to ever think, or at least the first academic, to think that maybe there's some history here that ought to be talked about, that people are not talking about. So I kind of specialize in that, and it's exciting, I think, to be the first to do that. So I use a gendered approach, because that's what we do in gender studies. I use a gendered approach to this history, which means I think about the way history happens in a gendered form. That is to say, how do men do this kind of history? That is to say, how do men approach, let's say, problems in the world from their denominational perspective, from their faith traditions perspective, and how do women approach it differently? So that's a gendered perspective, okay, gender studies. And what we discover, believe me, I'm not the first person to say this, lots of people support me in this, what we discover is that it was Southern Protestant lay men who led conservative challenges to racial and gender equality, gay rights, and so forth. While lay women, the ones I look at, organized for mission, that's another important point, those who are in the UWF and its predecessors, as a general rule, were far more liberal. usually not too far left of clergy, who were also well-educated and quite liberal, but clergy have to deal with this congregation that's dominated by men who were generally very conservative. So that's, I'm sure Angela can tell you, a bit of a restraint on their behavior and the kinds of things that they say. So I don't mean to say that the lay women were more liberal than the clergy, because typically they would agree with each other, but there was, again, a constraint on their behavior because of the people who, hired them and fired them, right? So they have to be careful about that. So generally far more liberal than other white people in the South, generally more liberal than men, Methodist men, and even in the South, they had an unusually expansive global outlook that diminished parochialism and narrow-mindedness and emphasized service and sacrifice, as I said, for the greater good, not for oneself alone, with the goal of ushering in the kingdom of God, which is kind of a utopian vision, right? It's another theme I want to play with a little bit and see how we can think about differing visions about that. But that utopian vision is really important because it keeps you motivated. Keeps you motivated when you're getting a lot of pushback. And again, let me just say, this is not easy for a lot of these women, the things that I'm going to talk about. So Methodists, as I mentioned, stood out as I was doing research about liberalism in the South, and particularly liberal faith traditions in the South. There are other, mainline denominations that are also fairly liberal. Presbyterians, for example, do a lot of the same things that Methodist women do, the kind of mission work, domestic mission work that Methodist women do, but their numbers are not very great. Methodists are the second largest denomination in the South. First is what? No, only in Louisiana do you say Catholic, by the way. I never get that answer anywhere else that I give talks. Catholic maybe around here, but go north of I-10, y'all. Go north, meaning Yankee territory, north of I-10. And then, yes, Baptist, of course. So Baptists are obviously the largest denomination in the South, and Southern Baptist, which is different from American Baptist. And they also tend to put their imprimatur, their mark on Southern religion, and to the point of what? Like, if I ask you to summarize the way you think about Southern religion in the 20th century, and that's what I do as 20th century, how would you describe it? Just overall. Impressions. Bible thumping, absolutely. Evangelical, let's put another name on that. Yes, evangelical. Fire and brimstone, a lot of that, sure. But you don't see a lot of that in Methodist churches, right? Anything else? Liberal, conservative. When you think Southern religion, if I asked anybody, very conservative. Where do they get that from? Baptists, right? So the thing is that people write a lot and think a lot about Baptists when they think about Southern religion, and they don't think about these progressive women, the progressive strain within religion. That was actually making a significant mark on history in the South. And so I'm determined as a historian to change that narrative, to surface these women, make them visible, because nobody does that, and show they're not all thinking like Baptists, and they're not all acting like Baptists. And you don't understand the history of the South if you think that that's the way people approach their faith tradition in the South, okay? So let's make them visible, which is an important part of what I do as well. So I do Methodists because of those things. They're the largest. They're the most autonomous of the women's organizations of any of the mainline denominations. And they're also very well educated, as again, I know you guys know this. Many of these women have college degrees or advanced degrees. Education makes a huge difference in the way people think about, progressivism, essentially. And in addition to that, as you know, there's a lifelong learning program. Right? Are you not participating in that? Right? It's an impressive study program. Well, they were reading all kinds of really progressive stuff in the earlier part of the 20th century. They're reading Black history, too, believe it or not. I mean, I was kind of gobsmacked by that, especially in the first half of the 20th century. They're reading James Baldwin and people like that, W.E.B. Du Bois, in their study groups. Those are all eye-opening things to do, and they're very unusual for white people to do them. They're the only people that I know of in the South who are doing that. They believed in, this is Methodism, this is Wesleyanism, they believed in translating their faith into action too, right? And so they do that. They believed that collective action was important to do that, that individual or single acts of kindness and individual prayers do not solve the problems of poverty and exploitation. Those are palliative measures. But we needed to do much more than that, which is to say, to attack the underlying structure of the society that allows people to be poor and oppressed, okay? So Band-Aids won't do it as far as they're concerned. And it can't be individual. Collective action has to do it too. Individual interpretation and study transform their ideas of domination and exclusion. This had to occur in communities, which again is what you do. Much of what I talk about you still do today. Circles of equals, this is how they defined it. Circles of equals who work together to produce liberating knowledge where people could engage in debate, not in the privatized spiritual realm of the individual solitary reader. It's not about private prayer. It's not about that. To quote Thelma, who I'll talk about in a minute, she said, "It has been said that a Christian should not go to church merely to find God, but to be reminded to go out in the world to meet God everywhere." Okay, so it's an activist faith tradition, which again, John Wesley modeled that, right? So they're drawing on that authority too. All right, now before 1939, we're talking about the MECS in the South. So a little bit of history. The Methodist Church, like every other Protestant denomination in the United States, split on the eve of the Civil War over slavery. So the Methodist Church, 1844, split into Southern, MECS is what we call that, and Northern, or non-Southern, I should say, because it's Western too. And they were not able to heal that rift until 1939. So they come together, MEC and MECS come together in 39, and they formed the Methodist Church. And that's what it's known as until 68, when there's another merger, and then it becomes the United Methodist Church, okay? So before 1939, I'm looking at and researching and writing and talking about women of the MECS, okay? And then after 39, and I'll talk more about that merger in a second too. Put a pin in it, I'll come back to it. Okay, the purpose, I'm gonna summarize this. It'll be very familiar to you. The purpose of these organizations, the Women's Division Missionary Associations, throughout all these mergers and name changes, their mission in the 20th century remained remarkably consistent. First, to meet the physical, emotional, and spiritual needs of women and children, right? Because men didn't pay attention to that, so they're gonna pay attention to that. Second, to work on bridging the racial divide. Eventually, they would work on desegregation. I'll talk about that too, if I don't run out of time. And racial inclusiveness. And third, you can guess this, participation and improvement of women in church and society. So that's a feminist thing to say. They're feminists from the very, very beginning. And if you think those Southern Methodist women were not feminists, I can tell you another bunches of things that will show that they were very feminist. Very much so. They pushed for laity rights, they pushed for ordination, all this before 1939. It's astounding, honestly, that you have that. And that's the same strain that I'm following with that later research that produces the book in 2016, right? That's it, going through the South. All right, what I want to talk about a little bit more now is their interracialism as I plug this talk. So they do pioneer in interracial activities in the South, these white women of the MECS. The MECS and then the Methodist Church is segregated, so the blacks are not in the same conferences as whites are, okay? One reason it took the Methodist Church so long to reunite, they're not the only ones, but one reason that it took so long to bring those two branches back together after the Civil War, they'd been talking for decades, actually. They'd been talking since the 1870s and didn't manage to do it until 1939, you might guess this, because white Southern, and again, we're talking about men who are in these positions of power, right? White Southern men did not want to merge into a church that might put black people in their conference. They don't want to worship next to black people. They don't want black people in their Sunday schools. They do not want black people in any position of authority above them. Unthinkable to them. So that's why they couldn't unite, and they just couldn't get over that impasse, the stumbling block of race. So what they did in order to bring it about in 1939 was compromise on this jurisdictional system, which of course you still have. But what they did, as you guys all know, is they created these 5 geographically based jurisdictions, and then they created one non-geographically based but racially based jurisdiction for African Americans, and that was called the Central Jurisdiction. So that meant, hold on, I'm gonna find my quote here. it meant that on the one hand, African Americans have their own conference, which means that they can move up, which is a good thing, right? So they can get some leadership abilities, but it also means that there's virtually no interaction between white and black in Methodism, right? So that's the divide that these Southern women are trying to overcome, is that divide. Both before 39 and then after 39, the divide between primarily white and black Methodist women, sorry. So at the uniting talks, as I mentioned, which are in 39, at the uniting talks when when North and South put aside their differences and agreed on this, this compromise measure to create the jurisdictions and by that measure perpetuate segregation in the Methodist Church, black delegates to the uniting conference spoke against that vigorously. Very unhappy about this, by and large. A few exceptions, everything I say, there's a few exceptions, okay? But guess what? The only white voices raised against the segregated central jurisdiction, the creation of the segregated jurisdiction, was the Women's Missionary Council of the MECS. It was white women. There was a committee led by Louise Young, I could talk a lot about her too, who was a professor of sociology at Scarrett, and she had worked at an HBCU, actually 2 HBCUs before she went to Scarrett. And she read a position paper saying that Jesus Christ should be the model for our behavior and not white Southern traditions. Absolutely. So this is an important thing to trace and bring forward when we talk about this Methodist history, is let's give them their voice back, right? So they pioneered in this. Their study programs, as I mentioned, included books on black history, other books that are being written at the time by African Americans, challenging the second-class status of African Americans in the United States. And this led them to a much broader vision than they would have had before that. For example, one of the things they do is come out against lynching, which doesn't sound very controversial, does it? You would think that lynching would not be controversial, but actually it was very controversial. And again, they're kind of the only white women to do this. In 1913, which still boggles my mind, they came out, wrote a position paper, sent it to everybody who mattered, saying that there should be a federal bill against lynching. Because state action didn't work. The states were on the side of the people who were doing the lynching, right? And so you had to go above them in order to get some a threat of force, obviously, or punitive action, punishment, for people who conducted lynchings. And there was never any punishment of people who conducted lynchings. I mean, the sheriffs were in there with the crowd, right? So they were horrified by this, the barbarity of lynching, that a civilized society allowed this to go without comment and without any kind of punishment. That's not right, they said. So they stuck out there in 1913 and came out in favor of a federal law that would help stop lynching. Okay, a couple of questions about that. They're the only white group to do that. There was an organization, it's kind of famous, called the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, which was largely Methodist throughout the South. It was led by a Methodist woman, Jessie Daniel Ames. And there's another organization that the historians might know, the Committee on Interracial Cooperation, which is out of Atlanta. Both of those are out of Atlanta. That was more male, but also working on the same kind of thing, like bridge building and stuff like that. So neither one of those organizations, the CIC nor the ASWPL, ever came out in support of a federal amendment against lynching. The only group that did that was UMW and your predecessors, okay? Very unusual. By the way, do you happen to know when that anti-lynching law passed? There were several attempts at it. Again, I don't need to go through the different name changes. When that law finally passed? Under Biden, 2022. There was opposition to it even then. Yeah, I know. It's hard to believe. And in 1913, they were doing this. Okay, so that's all part of their anti-racism. Let me move on before I take up too much of your valuable time and talk about one of their other initiatives. Oops, sorry, let me go. back, yep. And that is the Bethlehem Centers. The Bethlehem Centers were settlement houses, which I'll talk about in just a second, that this group, MECS Women, set up in African American neighborhoods. They're the only religious institution to do this. There's settlement houses in the north. Almost never do they serve black neighborhoods. Mostly it's immigrant neighborhoods where they set up shop in immigrant neighborhoods. They do that also, the MECS women. It's only the women that do this. Only the women have this mission activity, not the men, okay? They set up in immigrant neighborhoods or poor. They didn't always have to be immigrant, just poor, like mountaineers, for example, had really high rates of poverty and no schooling and stuff like that. So they would go into those areas as well. So it's not just urban, although it tended to be urban. But they're the only one that had as a mission, moving into African American neighborhoods. And they called those Bethlehem houses. So if you see that term, that means that's for African Americans, Bethlehem houses. The ones for white people, marginalized people, they generally, but not always, called Wesley houses. So if you see that name, it tells you. That's because everything's segregated, right, in the South. So those are the distinctions. Almost nobody knows this. There's all kinds of work done on the settlement house movement because it was extremely important in American history. Almost never talk about in this going on in the South. And literally dozens of them, well over 100 of these settlement houses throughout the South, established by MECS women as a part of their domestic mission. Okay, so let me show. So it's around the beginning of the 20th century. This is the first one I was about to tell you is 1912. So the very first Bethlehem house is in 1912 in Augusta, and we can kind of just flip through these. I got several slides to show you. Thelma Stevens, who I will come back to, directed this center in in Augusta, 1928 to 1939, when the merger happened. Let's see, next is Fisk. I think I have them in order. Fisk. I have to keep turning around. So is that Fisk that you're showing? Oh, I'm going to talk about that. Yeah, thank you. So in Louisiana, St. Mark's was the settlement house, okay? You all know that because why? Because it's still an NMI. Yeah, it's still a national mission institution, and you still support it. Yeah. So St. Mark's is one of these settlement houses, which has a different name than the others because it was kind of around the same time, but the person in charge decided to name it after St. Mark's Square in Venice because the immigrants who lived in that neighborhood were Italian. And so they thought that would be a way to kind of make it more accessible, like maybe help overcome any shyness or trepidation that they might have about going to this mission. That's in New Orleans, still in New Orleans on Rampart Street. They moved to Rampart Street in 1923. Excuse me. So that's an unusual one in that the name is different, but that's kind of rare for the name to be different. And the next one is, y'all tell me. No, sorry, thank you for telling me that. It after Katrina, it changed names and it's now Rampart Street Community Center. But it's still an I can't say those words, NMI, National Mission Institution. Thank you, yes. So you still contribute to that. And I'm going to, again, ask you in just a second some questions to get you interacting here. Next is Homa. McDonald, yeah, in Homa. So you're all familiar with that, too. Same reason, right? Because you still support that. It's an NMI. So what they did, the WMC, the Women's Missionary Associations of the Southern Church, what they did was locate places where there was an unmet need. And then they moved into those places and lived there. That's why they're called settlement houses. They lived there to help the local population get the services that weren't available to them. So in this area, in the Homa area, that's me on the steps, by the way. I visit these institutions everywhere. I look for their records and see what kind of work they had been doing or whatever is available to me at that time. But anyway, in the Homa area, they opened up a school. They would take boarders if people needed them, but for the most part, if people needed lodging, but for the most part, it's not residential. So in that area, there were two groups that didn't have public education or didn't use it available to them, which is that's the group they're serving. So the two groups, you might be able to guess, were Cajuns and the Homa Indians. The Homa Indians were mixed race, as you probably all know, and thus did not fit into black or white, so guess what? They couldn't go to school because all the schools were segregated, and so both of them turned them away. You're not white enough and you're not black enough to attend school with us, and so that's one of the reasons they established a school there. And then the other group was Cajuns, which is, again, interesting because they're Catholic, right? And they don't require you to convert to get the services. I'm sure you do the same thing. They offer, worship services and Bible study and lessons in how to write a good sermon to the pastors that come in. They offer all of that. They're also very well-educated people, these deaconesses are. But that's not mandatory. You don't have to attend the services, nothing, in order for us to assist you, right, in this community setting. And they also tended to be, Cajuns had the schools available to them, but they generally didn't send their children to school. You guys know why? Yes, it was English only, correct, yes, until our days when they changed over to Codeville and stuff. But it was English only, and the children, of course, were punished if they, and brutally sometimes, if they spoke French, yes. So needless to say, the parents just kept them home rather than subject your child to something like that. Was there a compulsory education law? Yes. Then people just didn't enforce it, right? Okay, so that's what my point there is where they saw that people needed the service, they would go into that area. A lot of Appalachian areas, too, where there was just almost nothing available to people there either. It's my time. Okay, I'm going to finish up here, I promise. Okay, so let me just finish with and I want to talk about Thelma for a second. Settlement houses were, we might say community centers now, call them something like that. They offered services, whatever the need was. Their boards were always integrated, another path-breaking thing to do. Their boards were always integrated, so it had people like them, well-educated white Methodists on the boards, but they always had people from the community on those boards too, because they don't want to be dictating to people what they might need. It's a collaborative effort, so they want the neighborhood to be able to help determine how the money was spent, right? They were very careful about that. They understood colonialism, right, and not just colonizing these places, but assisting them when they asked for help. And I will say, in a lot of cases, a lot of these Bethlehem centers, the African Americans are the ones that came and asked them to do it because they knew we don't have schooling available or whatever the case may be, right? So why are they called settlement houses? Because unlike community centers or like YM or YWCA, they were doing a lot of these same things too. They settled there. They lived there. So these white women are going into African-American neighborhoods and living there. They're settling there. The point of that being that they would have to endure the same circumstances that all these people endured on a daily basis. Well, you know what? That changes your view a whole lot when you do that. They discovered how abysmal it was in black neighborhoods, in the case of the Bethlehem centers, because the infrastructure was terrible. No white person knew this before. They assume everything's the same. We all do that. We all tend to assume what's for us is like that for everybody, right? So I had to go in there to look to see, guess what? It's not like that. They do not have the same things that we do, right? And here's why. And schools, they were gobsmacked by this too. They did not know that the schools were so badly funded for African Americans until they went in there and saw, well, don't we give them the same textbooks? Because, separate but equal is supposed to be equal, right? So as you probably all know, the South did the separate part but not the equal part. And so they got the same textbooks. You know what that meant? Some of you may remember this, because in our lifetime they did this. You do remember it. They took the ones that were all used up by the white, see, y'all remember this, by the white kids, and they gave them to the black kids, by which time they're very out of date, torn up, written in, you remember this, and useless. They should have been recycled, right? And not only that, but they tell these stories all the time. They had the students who were helping them to make the transfer from the white schools to the black schools write racist things in there before they transferred them over, right? That's equal, right? That was the equal part of equal. No, they paid taxes like everybody else, but nothing that they got was equal, right? So what that does is help them understand that the problem of poverty, this kind of poverty, it's not an individual failure. It's not because these people don't work hard. They obviously work very hard, 2 and 3 jobs. they don't have the same stuff. They don't have access to the same opportunities that white people had. Again, scales fall from the eyes when you go in there and you start to realize that. So what kinds of things did they provide? Again, whatever was needed. Daycare was one of the first things because they had kids running in the street because parents worked 2 and 3 jobs. And so the 6-year-old is watching the 3-year-old, and guess what? No place to recreate. Recreation also a part of this too, always. Supervised recreation. So gated yards, playgrounds, ball clubs, things like that. Always with supervision because the kids are not supervised in the street because the parents are both working. It's not laziness why this happens, right? They're underpaid, right? Economic justice was another part of their agenda, which again is kind of astounding, right? Recreation was always part of this because there simply was no recreation for African Americans, never. In black neighborhoods, the kids are playing in the streets in vacant lots. There's parks for the white kids, but not for the black kids. There's camps for the white kids, but not for the black kids. And so forth. There's pools for the white kids and not for the black kids. Do you realize the rate of drowning for African American children was exorbitantly high? You know this too, because they didn't have swim lessons. Why is it so much higher? Oh, they're stupid and they're not taking their kid and teaching their kid how to teach. They don't have access to it. So again, once you realize that, you can see it's structural, it's not individual, right? Collective problem needs a collective solution, so it has to be structural. So again, a variety of services that black people as well as white people collaborated to try to bring about. Who's next on my slide there? Y'all tell me, because okay, so another thing that they did was partner with HBCUs when they established these Bethlehem centers. Most of the time, that's why the first one was in Augusta, Georgia, because Payne was there. And Payne is an HBCU that was jointly supported, it's the only institution like this, jointly supported by the Methodist Church proper, by the MECS before 39, and by CME, which was another African American denomination. They used to call it Colored Methodist Episcopal, now it's Christian Methodist, CME, Christian Methodist Episcopal. So it's the only college that has both of those people supporting it. And in the early 1900s, the women, the WMC of the MECS, Southern Church, also agreed to help that institution, and they created something for the girls. They call it Payne Annex, which is on the campus of Payne, which had only been for boys before. So now they're opening up to girls. That's part of the mission, right, girls. And they buy a piece of property on that campus adjacent to the rest of the college, and they call it Payne Annex, very deliberately, because they do not want the men to think that they did this. They want everybody to know, no, the women did this, and we get to control this, right? They did not like anyone trying to undermine that authority or that power. So they built the buildings on Payne Annex. They provided scholarships because black people are so poor. They can't afford tuition, so they provided scholarships, not just to black people, they provided it to other people in need too. Lots of white people got these scholarships as well. So anyway, what they did is pair with these HBCUs. So like sociology programs would have interning requirements, and so the students would come into the Bethlehem Center and assist at the Bethlehem Center. And also the Bethlehem Center sometimes provided lodging for those students because they're coming in from out of town, right? And they need lodging, and there often was not enough lodging available for them. Oftentimes they would just stay in the homes of a black person, if it's a black college. So it's kind of a two-way street, like they're each helping each other. They're providing internships and giving the kids a job, which also helped. And well, basically they're working it off by staying there. The lodging is free, which they all needed that. Now let me just talk about that. These things are run, they're founded, they're run, they're managed by white women. They're all women that do this. Single women. You think there's an accident there? No, there's no accident there, okay? Single women, that means no one's telling them what to do, right? They're single initially. In fact, in order to be a deaconess, you had to be single. You could not work as a deaconess and be married. And they're almost all deaconesses that run these things. Anyway, back to my point about it's white people that run it. That means white people live there in the settlement, right? And you also have black students there? So how is that going on? It still amazes me to this day that they were not firebombed. Because promiscuity, as they call that, Lord, it's just because they were under the umbrella of a very well-respected denomination, right? How much trouble could they be causing? Oh, well, you'd be surprised. Okay, so Thelma, can you get to Thelma there? Is that Thelma? that's another one of the institutions that they supported. You still do, still a national. I can come back and talk about Bennett. Great story there, too. So a couple of slides about Bennett. Oh, and I know the reason I was going to talk about that, too, is one of the slides that I was talking to you about earlier, Isaac, where they have David and Susie Jones. David is the president of Bennett. He's black, but you can't tell. Like, he could pass, right? And Susie is his wife. And Susie was the one that Thelma Stevens, who I'm about to talk about next, worked with, because as I mentioned, they always made it collaborative. It's not white people dictating to black people, but working with, collaborative, co-equal relationship to see what they need and how we can help. So Susie Jones was the one very well-educated person, okay? Thelma's very well-educated too, that she worked with to try to develop. So what happened when the churches merged in 1939, a lot of those women that were in the South, that were working in the South as deaconesses or in charge of settlement houses, went up to the national offices in New York City. That's important because what that means is these Southern women that I'm talking about and writing about are disproportionately influential in the newly created national church. And Northerners do not know how to deal with African Americans, right? Because they just don't deal with that population, right? Excuse me. Who does? We do. And we're trying to improve the situation and improve the relationship, right? They're not talking about integration yet, but just give them a short while, okay? At first, they don't touch that. All right, so Thelma, is she up there yet? Okay, thank you. Thelma goes on up to the women's division, head of the Department of Christian Social Relations. Becky, that's that same committee you mentioned, that's it. And there, she had charge of a lot of things. Eventually, this got pared down. But she hammered home that God's kingdom would not appear, I'm quoting her, until the barriers of separation among God's children had fallen away and given place to fellowship. Again, on an equal basis. Until all people experienced full human and civil rights, and every Southerner who heard that knew exactly what she was saying. Until the practice of inferior and superior races and political repression had ended. Again, quoting her. The tradition of states' rights that infringes upon human freedoms and security must go! Exclamation point. And Jesus said, all men are brothers, yet we conveniently ignore this teaching. She is not pulling any punches, right? And by the way, you ladies, look in your own household too. Don't be smug. How much are you paying your maid? And is it a living wage? Ooh, you know? It's a lot harder to talk about these kinds of things when it's real close, up close and personal. You're sending all these missionaries out to foreign lands. There's a lot of work done on them, which is one reason I don't work on them. You're sending all these missionaries out to foreign lands to help women and children in foreign lands, but you don't want to help them in your backyard? See? It's just much more controversial to do that, right? It's not easy. It's much easier to say, let's go to Korea and throw money at that situation, right? Well, look in your own backyard. All right, so what are they going to do? Again, lots of pronouncements. So Thelma Stevens goes up to New York, and the first thing that she did as in charge of this department was say, we're only going to have our meetings, our annual meetings, which is, again, everybody now. We're only going to have our meetings in places where everyone can be accommodated equally. Any place that segregates, we're not meeting. Direct action, boycott, right? So they did it. They pulled it off. And now I'm going to forget where it was. I think I'll come back to it. I think it was in some place in Ohio, but they moved it, like it had originally been in a place where segregation was practiced. But again, we're an organization that's black and white together. We're only going to meet where they can be equally accommodated. Columbus, I wrote it down, thank goodness. It had been in St. Louis, and it moves to Columbus, okay? So there's a form of direct action in putting her belief into work, into action. In 1942, the same year that she says we're not meeting, or 41, not meeting anywhere that everybody is not equally accommodated, and that became the policy of the Women's Division from that point on. Not the policy of the men immediately, the General Board, but they eventually do prevail upon the General Board to do that, to take up that same policy of only meeting where everyone could be equally accommodated. Okay, so again, just to get you an idea of how radical they were, in 1942, the Women's Division, this is on Thelma Stevens' urging, issued a policy statement in support of the economic rights of workers. They were very pro-labor. They supported the Social Creed of 1908, calling for equal pay for equal work, irrespective of race, creed, nationality, or sex, in 1942, I want to remind you, and calling for all women to establish fair labor standards in their own homes, like I just told you, by paying helpers enough to provide, quote, a sound basis for proper standards of living. Don't let yourself off the hook, okay? She prevailed upon the Women's Division to pass these things, these resolutions, and to denounce the government's policy of forced relocation of Japanese Americans, which happens during the war, the first religious organization to do so. All right, so Thelma Stevens is determined that they will not practice segregation. And she wants everybody who's part of this group, which of course is not everybody, as you guys know. Like, not every Methodist is automatically a part of UMW. In order to become a part, you pay money, you make a commitment, right? You agree to put the beliefs into action, whatever they might be, right? Decide on those. So it's not just everybody that we're talking about, but if you have made a commitment and put money down, pledged to support these things, here is what we want you to do. Begin to desegregate your field where you are. Begin to desegregate that now. But the problem was, nobody knew whether or not the segregation that was being practiced was custom or law. Nobody could tell. So guess what she did? Next slide, Polly Murray. Oh, I talked about her earlier, sorry. Told you I messed up these PowerPoint. Keep going. Murray, yeah. Polly Murray, who's very, very huge in feminist circles. She's an African-American woman who eventually became an Episcopal priest. She was ordained. Anyway, she at the time was unemployed because she's a black female lawyer. Who's going to employ her, right? She went to Howard, so she's in Washington, D.C., and needed work. She was hungry, could barely pay the rent. And so she and Thelma Stevens became friends, and in 1948, Stevens had the Women's Division hire her, Polly Murray, a Southerner by birth, to research and compile information about state segregation laws, and the result was, a 750-page reference book, States' Laws on Race and Color, that for the first time exposed restrictive state laws to public view and comparison. It made plain that segregation was practiced even where there was no law that mandated it. So your point is, you're not going to be able to tell me you can't do that because I'm looking in here to see what the law is, okay? And it's not saying you have to practice segregation. You're going to integrate, okay? If you want to stay in this group, right? By the way, that thing filled a huge gap. They bought tons of copies of it, so they're paying her to do the research, Paula Murray, to do the research, and that was 2 years, and eventually she kept working on it. There's a supplement later, 5 years later. But anyway, it's this huge 750-page tome, an encyclopedic tome, which they purchased copies of, and they sent out to churches and units of UWF, and libraries all over, schools all over. They made it free to distribute to anybody who was interested. And it becomes very famous and necessary for people who are doing civil rights law. Thurgood Marshall, who was the chief attorney for the NAACP, referred to it as the Bible of desegregation lawsuits. Thelma Stevens from Mississippi was responsible for that. She had to continuously go back to the Women's Division to encourage them to keep the money coming to pay Polly Murray so she could finish the work and then buy the books. Okay, so this was something, and next is it charter? Yeah, thank you. And so she had Polly Murray do that because she wanted this charter. She wanted the Women's Division to agree to accept this charter, which you still have, and is still, modified over the years, obviously. It's not 1952 anymore, but you go on the website, and it's there. You can see the modern charter. And it does what I already mentioned to you. It obligates the Women's Division to desegregate all of its facilities and to hire, basically affirmative action to try to hire more African Americans into positions. It was passed unanimously. It was passed unanimously at the national level, but of course individual units can do it or not, right? There's a lot of discretion for them. It was adopted in January 1952, so 2 years before the Brown decision. And then the Brown decision was handed down in 54. It was May 54, and the Women's Division happened to be meeting in their annual conference that day when it was handed down in May 1954. So guess what? The Women's Division became the first division, the first organization within the Methodist Church to endorse the Brown decision. The General Conference followed not long after, but they still had the distinction of endorsing. Do you know how controversial that was in the South? You remember that too, don't you? Oh, very controversial in the South. She got a lot of hate mail, Thelma Stevens did. Remember, she's single. That makes it easier for her, right? She doesn't have a husband that would be worried about, blowback against his business, for example. And volunteers often were married, but she's staff. Thelma Stevens is staff. And again, what that means is it's women who are paying her salary. So that emancipates her, right? All right, so she got a lot of blowback about it, but nonetheless, they adopted it and began to move forward. Eventually, the General Conference did something very similar to that. So as time went on, the Women's Division endorsed virtually all civil rights and war on poverty legislation, and even helped to fund the Delta Ministry, which is National Council of Churches Ministry, which did assist voting rights drives. Generally, these women are not in the front lines of anything. They're supportive in the background, providing safe spaces. That's one reason I was going to talk about Bennett. Providing safe spaces where civil rights organizations that were integrated could meet without fear of retaliation. They often met in Methodist women's division spaces. So Bennett College was one of those, because Greensboro is where the first sit-ins were held. Guess where those people met to plan those sit-ins? Bennett College, because the president, thank you. The president welcomed them and also helped protect them so that there would not be harm coming to them, okay? Bennett, also Gulfside, if you're familiar with Gulfside, it was ruined in Hurricane Katrina, was another one. St. Mark's did the same thing. St. Mark's also provided a safe shelter, a haven for people who were working in the civil rights movement in Louisiana, too, as did the others. So it's a very left-leaning group. It's a very left-leaning organization. Again, there's exceptions. Not everybody agreed with all this, but there's enough of them to make an impact. By the way, at its height, which I think was in '68, we're talking about 1.7 million members. That's a lot of people, y'all. And so when people ask me, why Methodist? I tell them all the things I've already told you, but I also say 1.7 million people. How can you ignore that? That was the largest Protestant organization in the United States, and nobody wants to write about that. They don't even know where those records are, in a separate place in the archives, right? Oh, let me dust them off and give them to you, because nobody ever asked for these, right? And you guys know you generate a bunch of paper, don't you? Methodists are very methodical. Sometimes I thank them and sometimes I curse them. Because the records, that's what I use to do this stuff. But they're not always very complete, right? And so sometimes, and they don't tend to put, well, let me put it this way. Minutes and reports, such as you guys do regularly, are approved, right? They go through a bunch of I's before they get published. Well, that's going to have a dampening effect, right? If they have to be approved, they don't want anybody to say anything that might be embarrassing for them later, right? So that's the part I really miss. I don't have like memoirs. That would help a lot if I had that. Like people who were in the thick of it, that would tell me, what was the debate like? What was the discussion like? Who said this? Who said the other? And how did that make you feel? Which I'm sure was terrible. Like sometimes they can't even go back to their families because they're against what their families and they themselves are on opposite sides. Yes. The Brown decision and everything else that had to do with civil rights and war on poverty and all that. Usually Southern families do not generally support those things. Southern white families do not support the civil rights movement at all, period. But the women did, at least the Women's Division of the Methodist Church. All right, so I'm about to wrap it up here. I know y'all have questions. I missed my place. Sorry, I accidentally moved away from where I was. Let me find that. Oh, I was going to say, so yes, it was so controversial. The kinds of positions that they were taking were so controversial, and again, by they, I mean Women's Division was taking. They were so controversial that they actually got red-baited. If you remember, some of you old enough remember that, like called communist, which of course you hear that out of Trump's mouth every minute of every day now. So it doesn't mean the same thing today because it's thrown around so much as it did like in the 50s, when, boy, that was very tarnishing for somebody to accuse you of being a communist in the Cold War, right? And they actually did get accused of, there was a group of people that called it Methodism's pink fringe, meaning they're so far left that they're kind of moving into red territory, right? And they got red-baited. And it did have an effect. It did kind of cause them to mute a bit and kind of work more back towards the center. They were actually more radical in 1913 than 53, I would say, because of the accusations against them. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I will tell you about Thelma Stevens if you want me to, but I'm over my time limit, and I know you must have questions. So if you want me to, I can talk about Thelma because I adore her, but but I can also wait. So any questions from the assembled? Uh-huh. Yeah, I said they're NMIs today, National Mission Institution today, yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yes, DULAC is also part of that too. Uh-huh. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, right. And there's, of course, a list of NMIs on the website, on the Women's Division website. Yeah.
You said McDonald House service the Cajun children.
Uh-huh.
How did they accommodate the language? Did they teach in French? Did they teach them?
Nobody that I know of spoke French that was running these. Maybe they had interpreters. That's a good question. I actually am not quite sure of the answer to that. So more research for me to do. Yeah, I don't recall seeing an address. And like I said, I went over there and read through what they had on file. Yeah, somehow they communicated. I don't know. Maybe they were, because what the schools wouldn't do was teach them English, right? Public schools wouldn't teach it, so just throw them in there and tell them they can't speak French. And of course, then they're in bad situations. So I presume what they're doing is kind of introducing English skills to these children so that they would be in a position to, communicate with a larger society, essentially. It's one reason that Cajuns were so insular is because of that, right? Good, thank you for that question. So my whole family is asking questions here, y'all. Y'all need to jump in there. It's my sister Gwen, my brother Bruce, my sister-in-law Becky, if y'all didn't know that. My son is over there, daughter-in-law. And did you forget Nixie, or where did he go? Oh, okay, thank you. He'd probably come hollering. Well, oh, no, I don't think so, but we could go check that. Newell is a Methodist name. Again, doing this research, I begin to recognize family names that you will see in the Methodist, and that is one. So I don't know, and I'm a little bit flummoxed by that group, because Speedy was Cajun. So wasn't he Catholic? I don't understand. Yeah. He's talking about the Newells that came here. He's talking about the Newells that came here that were, sorry, did you? No. Yeah, so that's a person who died, and I didn't get to interview them before they died, which kind of makes me really sad. There's a lot of people like that. Anyway, yes.
Janet, any suggestions for what Southern Methodist women can be doing today?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's hard to pick one, isn't it? Which one are you going to go after first? Well, all I can say is do what they did. They did a lot of lobbying, not in person. They would write, but they pushed that. After women got the right to vote in 1920, they really wanted women to exercise that franchise and apprise themselves of issues. So they pushed that a lot. There was, again, a lot of education that went on, which really makes a difference about the issues. Facts, because as a 501c3 or whatever it was called then, churches couldn't endorse a candidate, right? But they could say, well, here's who's running, and here's who stands on this and that and the other. So I would just suggest that. I've given a talk about the updated Charter for Racial Policies before, too, and come to find out, should have asked y'all, a lot of the women that I was talking to, groups like this, didn't even know they had a charter for racial policies, and there's a more modern one up on the website today. So I would just suggest making that part of your work, I guess you would say, a line of work among your groups. But there's nothing that's going to be more effective politically than calling your representatives and writing postcards, which is what they did a lot of. They also did a lot of visits, they called it, which is going into homes and neighborhoods by invitation, but offering themselves. Not like ICE, being welcomed into those homes. And so that they could, again, kind of learn. They don't know, because if you're white, you live on the other side of the line. You have no idea what goes on in black neighborhoods or why they're so impoverished. So that they could kind of find out what these people needed. And then also, of course, black people couldn't vote because they were disfranchised in the South until 1965. But at least kind of be an advocate on their behalf, right? I love my Methodist women, and I hate to ever say anything that might be construed as criticism, but I don't see a whole lot of cross between the white and the black churches today. So there's an avenue And the fact is that research shows that the more people are close to or introduced to people who are othered, kind of the less hostile they are to them. So if you're not making those overtures to African American Methodists, maybe that's something you guys could do. In fact, I sort of tried that myself. It didn't work. I'm not in any kind of influential position to make that happen, but I've raised this before. Like, are you doing racial relations studies? Are you doing anything? Are you reaching out to African American neighbors? I'm not surprised if Angela's done it. And do you have something you want to say? Yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Oh, I was just asking about what kind of overtures white Methodists might make to black Methodists to bring them together and share ideas or resources, whatever the deal is. Are those? Oh, good.
So I think that one thing that I noticed since disaffiliations
Mm-hmm.
is that at the annual conference level, the percentage, like we didn't add another African American church to the conference, right? We haven't planted a new church, but the percentage of African American churches represented at the Louisiana Annual Conference is much greater because most of the churches that disaffiliated
We're white.
were white.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of similarly, most of, not all, but most of the pastors who disaffiliated were older white men.
Are we surprised?
So the number of female clergy, not the number hasn't increased so much, but the percentage of the ones in the room and the whole feeling of attending annual conference, I believe is positively, not that, we're always sorry to see, folks go,
Uh-huh.
but the kind of creativity that women bring to problems and the amount of exuberant praise and worship and especially extemporaneous prayer that's brought from our African American brothers and sisters, it's really transforming our culture as Methodists in Louisiana.
That's such great news. And you,
My name is Janet Allured. I'm the founder and the president of Mossville Environmental Action now, and also come from a mother who was Methodist.
and was she also part of a group like this, UMC, United Methodist Women, sorry, UMW?
Myself, knowing that the transition that women had to have their rights paid in the first place, because it wasn't just African Americans had problems with racism, it was also the women trying to get rights.
So women having problems with oppression or discrimination because of their gender, yeah, right. Those two things correlate.
As far as maybe amending old laws, that's one way of starting it. And trying to still
Good point. When she was asking about action to take, yeah, good point.
on the other end of that, I think that when white Methodists, I hate to use the word white, because European Methodists, along with African American Methodists, I think it needs to start where it started at back then, women.
With the women.
So when you start inviting first women, the first lady of the church, the pastor's wife, and it kind of like helps
That's right.
lead in. When you have musical activities, choir activities, stuff, singing for Christmas, maybe
Yes.
uh-huh. Invite churches like that in. But my mother left the Methodist church because she was alongside her mother-in-law, so I became in the religion of being sanctified. That's what they call them, holy rollers, in the Holy Ghost. And I thank God I received that along with Christ Jesus and God. So it gave me an open mind for a very long time about why racism even existed.
Well, thank you for coming. Uh-huh, yeah.
But nevertheless, when you look at things and you look at the big picture now, we in what, 21st century, 2025 if you go into 2026. So churches have to sooner or later come together. We all gonna come together because of what we're gonna have to have and face challenges that's coming up. You know,
Thank you.
never was an issue with racism. It was an issue with the United States government itself brainwashing its people. Because when it really came in with that info to that slavery, people telling us how to fight the white against the black and
Thank you. I'll try to get a little bit, few other questions in here. Anyone else? Questions?
you're gonna see that the United States didn't just hustle black folk and keeping them down. They hustled all of us, no matter who we were, where we come from, what color we were, what cultures we had and differences. Wasn't an issue. It was an issue of the whole big word control. And as long as they can keep people brainwashed like that, even today, it's gonna continue to go on. Because you got people who believe in what they believe. I'm gonna stop, but, you know, I'm just one of them people, I'll open up conversations so you can have real conversations.
I'm sure everybody will be happy to talk with you. Thank you. Angela?
So I think that the way you describe some of the women, you know, kind of beginning to reside in these communities, you know, going in with these homes and residing among those who they're serving alongside, reminds me of participatory action
Yep.
research.
Yes, exactly.
Which is you know, an academic way of saying you don't go in thinking that you know the solution to the problems that people are facing. The people who are facing the problems are the experts because they're the ones with the problems. So, and I am in a cross-cultural ministry context as a Yankee in the South, right? I mean, I've been here 20 years, but I still have 35 years of my life before I even got here. So I, you know, see things from, you know, a different perspective. I cannot come into a church in the South and say, oh, well, you know, the way they do it back up in Pennsylvania, it's so much better. Y'all just need to do it this way, right? How well would that go over? So I think some of the answers to crossing the racial divide, the economic divide, is spending time together, right, as equals.
Yep.
Right? Getting together, asking not loaded questions, but honest questions, sitting with the problems with people. We have problems, others have problems. If we sit together, not just for an hour at
Right.
a planned meeting, but over time are developing relationships, the Holy Spirit is going to reveal not only the issue, but a way or ways forward in that. It's not just putting a Band-Aid, not just charity, and charity is
Right.
a good thing, but also to seek justice. Like how can we
Right.
do that?
Thank you for making that distinction. So clear. Yeah, it's charity is kind of feel good, like it makes you feel good, like you're doing something, but you're not solving the problem. And so, yes, it has to be systemic, right? And I love what you said too about not an hour here or there. I mean, let's really get to know each other, which is again what they were trying to do. They were building bridges across that racial divide, and you can't do that 1 hour a month or something like that. Yeah.
My
Angela.
question is, of all the women who are highlighted in the book, which one would you choose to spend an hour with?
The three that I wrote on were Thelma Stevens, Teresa Hoover, who was the first African American woman to be the head of a mainline denomination division, and Peggy Billings. And it would be hard for me to pick among those three because they're all heroes in my eyes. I will say a couple of things about those women. Thelma Stevens and Peggy Billings were both from Mississippi, and then ended up going up into the national church. But again, they knew what the situation was like in Mississippi and really wanted to change that situation if they could. Thelma Stevens had a local connection here. This is where I'm kicking myself. Does anybody know? Dorothy Carter. Did y'all know that? Dorothy Carter worked with Thelma Stevens for years at the Bethlehem Center in Augusta. And she, of course, ended up coming here and marrying Carter, Mr. Carter. And they were the church I went to, which was First Methodist. And what I hear is that Thelma, because they were friends, Thelma would come in and visit, vacation, come in and stay with Dorothy Carter. And I'm like, why didn't I know that? So many lost opportunities. Peggy Billings, the same thing. And Teresa Hoover, who's another one of the really path-breaking leaders of this feminism, basically, feminist leader, is from Fayetteville, Arkansas, which is where I live. And I went to graduate school, and I didn't know. Again, just kicking myself. Oh, my gosh. But fortunately, there are interviews out there that people did that filled in a lot of gaps for me, for Thelma Stevens, Peggy Billings, and Teresa Hoover. But again, I don't have memoirs from any of them. It would be better if I could talk with them and help fill in those gaps. So I'm sad about that. So I'd like to know them better and their own journey from A to B, right? Yeah.
Don't forget to tell them about your book.
Oh, thank you. And I know I've kept you all in your seats for far too long. It's time for me to go step down, and I'll be happy to talk with you all individually if you want. But yeah, so I have books for sale. Again, it's an edited book, so you don't necessarily, it's a collection of individual biographies, so you can dip in and out. You don't necessarily read it from front to back. It doesn't read that way. Just pick something you're interested in and read that, right, and come back to it another time. And I hate to say this, it's not my doing, but if you go to the website, it's University of Florida Press, it's $95. I know, it's terrible. But I got a discount, so I'm selling them, and this includes everything, shipping, taxes, everything, for $60, which is still exorbitant, I know. But believe me, it does not give me buku royalties, okay? Academic books never do that. But the publisher incurs a lot of costs in the production of that book, and so they're trying to recoup that. And everybody asked about the paperback. They told us that the paperback will probably come out in a couple of years, so you can wait for that. Usually those are $30 or $35 for the paperback. But the hardback is what they call the library price. They want institutions to buy it, and so they jack the price up. Although yesterday I heard about a colleague of mine whose book is selling for $225, so I felt like, oh, $95 is not that bad. So did I cover everything? And Becky will be helping me back there when I step down to, if you decide that you want to purchase one. And again, if you would just kind of get them for your libraries. I know Angela's done that for here, but if you have other libraries that might be interested in them, and then talk it up. And I've heard again from other people that, I'm looking at progressive women and what they went through and the changes they're trying to make in order to usher in God's kingdom on earth. And I like history to be inspirational. Like, we're under siege right now, and Methodist women that I speak to who also feel themselves sometimes alone, as Thelma and Peggy and the rest of them did, feel like they're alone in a conservative world, the book should be really meaningful to them, because you can look back to see what other people went through, and it's not easy to be ostracized by your community of people because you support the Brown decision and they don't, right? That's hard. And so they persevered anyway. Eye on the prize, right? You go for that social justice issue and don't stop with charity at Thanksgiving, right? And in the end, that's gonna, well, of course, in their view, they would have said, it's gonna get me into the kingdom of God, right? But it's not about that either. It's just about right order in the world and creating God's heaven on earth, kingdom on earth, reign of God on earth, they would have said. Okay, yeah, Mickey.
I do want to give a shout out for your Louisiana Women.
Okay, thank you.
I read it how many years ago?
Well, it came out in 2016, so she's talking about the first book. Oh, thank you.
Reading it and just thinking, these are my people.
Yep,
I really
that's right.
think it's a connection in every woman's story.
Thank you very much. Yes, and I highlight that faith tradition being important to these women. They're feminists, not despite of their faith, not in spite of their faith. They're feminists because of their faith, because that's how they read the Bible. is that Jesus and God wanted men and women to be equal. He doesn't support oppression or discrimination. That's contrary to my Bible anyway, right? So yes, thank you for that, Mickey. All right, I know you guys are ready to go, so I will call a halt and answer questions individually or speak with you individually if you want after I go sit down. Thank you. Appreciate y'all inviting me to be here. Oh, you get out of the way.
Janet, thank you so much for working us into your schedule. I know you were at McNeese earlier this week, and I know that when you come down, you get to visit with family, so we're really glad that you're able to double up on that. You've heard it said, hopefully, that well-behaved women rarely make history. Have you heard of that? I got this shirt from the Methodist archives at my seminary, Drew University. I know you spent some time there. This one says, Methodist women boldly make history. So. Yeah, that's good. And then one of my favorite stickers, I love this so much I haven't decided what to put it on, because once I put it on it, it'll be permanent. So I carry this sticker around with me. Jesus protected women, empowered women, honored women publicly, released the voice of women, confided in women, was funded by women, celebrated women by name, learned from women, respected women, and spoke of women as examples to follow. He did the same for men. I'm not forgetting the men in the room, but it was remarkable and controversial that he did so for the women as well. I've chosen a benediction. It's going to be up on the screen. It's a call and response. I'm going to have to turn around to say it. This was actually the call to worship, with just a couple words changed, given by Bishop Kammerer, who we already talked about. We saw a picture of her earlier. She's the bishop in Florida area right now. And so I'll just take her part in this. We gathered today to celebrate disciples who were loyal to Jesus Christ through the United Methodist Church, reflecting their deep commitment to embody God's dream for the world. We too seek to be and to form disciples empowered by the Holy Spirit who love boldly, passionately and actively loving God and neighbor, including people of every age, nation, race, gender, and walk of life, serve joyfully, journeying alongside the most vulnerable and with a Christ-like heart, offering care and compassion with joy, lead courageously, following Jesus' example by resisting and dismantling all systems of evil, injustice, and oppression, striving for peace, justice, and reconciliation, awaken us to the grace that not only draws us to God, but sends us out into the world that God so deeply loves. And let all of God's people say, Amen. Enjoy your time visiting with each other. Do not feel like you have to leave right away. I hope that you'll visit with Janet and, yes, and enjoy the food, because there's still some food left.